Hey guys, Ron here, and I've made a bunch of videos counting down stuff like the worst parts of every generation, most controversial Pokemon of every generation, and even best Pokemon design of every generation. And I think it would be very good for my Fakemon artist journey to highlight what makes for the worst Pokemon designs of every generation. Keep in mind, a good design doesn't equal a good Pokemon design. So for example, Sonic is a good design, but it would look terrible as a Pokemon. So keep the following criteria in mind, because there are misconceptions as to what makes a bad Pokemon design. We're looking for bad execution of a concept, not a bad concept. For example, having a garbage Pokemon is not the best concept, but for a Pokemon made of garbage, Garbodor is designed adequately. You just hate the concept. Just because a Pokemon is a missed opportunity for a different concept, that doesn't mean that the design they chose is bad. Bad evolutions are also not bad designs. If you don't like how Graveler evolved into a Golem, that doesn't mean Golem is inherently bad. If something is boring, like Lumineon, that doesn't mean it's a bad design either, just not among the most interesting. Ugly also doesn't mean bad. I mean, sometimes a Pokemon is designed to be ugly, like Barbaracle. That's the point. It's a successful design. And just because a Pokemon is humanoid like Machoke, that also doesn't mean it looks bad either. It's all down to execution. Which designs are the most lazy, uninspired, botched, or completely go against what the fans kind of want to see in a design? We'll find out right now. Keep in mind, this list is biased. Design is subjective. That's why I made this list on stream with the input of thousands of viewers. So thanks to you guys, at least the end product feels more complete instead of the ramblings of a person who technically kind of likes pretty much every Pokemon here. I only hate 2 of the many Pokemon we'll discuss today. Never mind 3. Let's begin with Generation 4. Imagine we did that instead of always beginning with Generation 1. Whatever, Generation 1. It has more entries on its list than any generation, considering the inspiration behind most of these designs were way more limited, and the roster is huge too, so it was tough setting aside our biases since we're used to these iconic Pokemon, but we have to start somewhere. Number 8. Pidgey. Keep in mind, it's supposed to be simple. It's most probably the first Pokemon you'll ever encounter, so Game Freak had to ease you into the Pokemon world with something you're super familiar with. People throw around the term, it's just a blank, like it's just a dog or it's just a set of keys, and most often that's not true. Game Freak will do something, whether it be a tweak in the design or concept that makes the design unlike anything you can encounter in the real world. Even Rattata, Pidgey's equal, isn't on the list because its proportions, expression, and colors make it completely different from what you could see in the real world, so I have to say it. Pidgey is just a bird. It's appealing and works, but I gotta acknowledge that it's one of the least creative Pokemon ever. Keep in mind, I could be convinced that the concept is what is wrong with Pidgey, since it has well-designed markings, but to be fair, it shares those markings with its family. Number 7. Tangela. The concept of a mysterious creature hidden within vines is great. The problem is the execution. Redesigns like the one by Bonnie John exemplify how Game Freak could have easily kept every aspect of the original Tangela while giving it vines that look like vines, and legs that aren't default cartoon shoes, but rather integrated into its body naturally. I generally think Tangrowth made the concept way more natural looking. The original is something a kid could make, while we needed something with an artist's touch. Number 6. Hitmonchan. The head is okay, and the shoulder pads have potential, but this may be one of the most egregious examples of Pokemon with clothes. There are tons of creatures in this franchise who have patterns and body parts that allude to clothes in a clever way, while Hitmonchan completely fails to do the same. Even the gloves are literal boxing gloves. I'm willing to give it the benefit of the doubt and say that the genius way of incorporating clothes into Pokemon designs wasn't yet established in Generation 1, but looking back, it's still uninspired. Number 5. Electrode. Once again, the concept is fine. That's basically why Voltorb isn't here. When you want to create a mimic in the world of Pokemon, yeah, a sentient Pokeball isn't that bad of an idea. And I like the concept that they simply explode when revealed, so Voltorb's angry expression is appropriate. Electrode's face, which gives off the vibe of a troll, also makes sense. But we were already skirting the line of what was justifiable in a Pokemon design, so when you evolve the borderline lazy design into a Pokemon with the same exact body and much simpler and cartoony expression, I gotta call out the design. Bad evolutions doesn't mean bad designs, unless the pre-evolved form was already close to a bad design. You feel me? Number 4. Ekans. It doesn't get a pass like Rattata since snakes in real life can have remarkable colors, mixed with the fact that it has nearly the same proportions, personality, and abilities as a real snake. I mean, even its tongue is less fantastical than the forked tongue of a real snake. What makes it a pocket monster other than the big eyes? Game Freak is lucky snakes are already cool and deadly looking, so it's kinda monstrous, I guess. Number 3. Krabby. Once again, we have a literal animal. There used to be a trend of comparing the proportions of old and new Pokemon, and people would trick themselves into thinking that later generation crabs were worse because they were rounder, even though Pokemon like Crabrawler are far more creative than Krabby. I think the fact that Krabby's rendered like a real crab is uncreative. It's a good drawing of a crab. Good job, Sugimori, but at least Seal has a tail that kinda looks like a water fountain. It also has a spike and some fangs. Real Seals don't have that, while Krabby offers nothing. Number 2. Mr. Mime. This is the most humanoid Pokemon in existence. It's entertaining, but I'm sure it would still be fun with a slightly different design. Its body parts are too vague and actually transgress Sugimori's own rule of diligently creating characters whose biology and environment are highly considered. While Mr. Mime, at least to me, seems more like a clown caricature than a creature. At the end of the day, it makes fans, a lot of fans, uncomfortable. I'm sure it has its followers, but it may be the last Pokemon some kid would wish into existence. And that is the truest test of whether or not a Pokemon design is great. At least unintentionally. I'm sure no kid wants Baynet to be real, but Game Freak intended for that to be creepy. Before we check out my number 1 pick, let's talk about some dishonorable mentions, as well as Pokemon that some may think have terrible designs, but are actually slightly better than your first instinct. Our first dishonorable mention is Persian. It's a good design, but super uncreative. It would be fine in any other franchise, but as a Pokemon, it has the literal proportions of a cougar. Same colors even, without an ounce of inspiration anywhere but its forehead. Its personality saves it from having one of the blandest designs in the franchise though. Venomoth is worse. I'm gonna refrain from saying it's a literal moth. Conceptually it is, but design-wise it's more palatable than a real moth. It has soothing colors and unique head crest, but goddamn is it a forgettable cartoon moth. Dugtrio is one of the laziest evolutions. It's literally 3 Diglets, and Diglett already has a minimal design. But moles do huddle together in their underground holes, so it gets a pass. It's still fun. And Muck is one of the least creative Pokemon. It's based on the general trope of sludge monsters and doesn't do anything to differentiate itself from similar concepts. It was gonna be on the list, but for a sludge monster, it's intimidating and conveys exactly what Game Freak wanted it to. Alolan Muck is way better though. But here are some Pokemon that I don't think have bad designs. I talked about Seal for a few seconds ago, but Dugong is clowned on for having a pretty simple design. However, I think it's pretty majestic. Sure, would have had a better design in a later generation, but it has its place. People can't decide whether Graveler or Golem are terribly designed. I can agree that Graveler is a bit clunky, but it's a pile of gravel. Of course it would be. Golem doesn't look like its Prevos, which is valid, but like I said, a bad evolution doesn't mean a bad design. On its own, Golem looks cool and original to me. Execute is close to bad, but for a group of psychic eggs, it's entertaining, and each seed has its own personality. Magneton is another evolution that changes nothing, but the fact that magnets attract other magnets is well done. Poliwrath is a boring evolution, but as a design, it offers a cool factor that Poliwhirl does not. Machoke is humanoid, which isn't a bad thing. Its face is very much not a primate. That's why it's not a bad design. But my number 1 pick does not do enough to curb its uncanniness. Jinx. It's based on the Yuki-Onna, Yamamba, and Ganguro fashion, so it could have been something special, but they had their work cut out for them. I'm barely gonna mention the blackface allegations, because turning Jinx purple didn't really fix anything. Its human hair, lips, hands, and one of the worst examples of clothes on a Pokemon make it a literal nose away from just being a human woman. It's not scary like a Yamamba, it's not cute like a Ganguro, it barely gives off Ice-type vibes like a Yuki-Onna, which inspired Frostlass too. It's simply the worst executed mishmash of concepts in Generation 1. Thank God Generation 2 only has 2 entries. It doesn't mean it has more amazing designs, just that it has less terrible ones. Game Freak learned what was more marketable. So the worst designs aren't ugly, just uncreative. Number 2. Ladybug. It's a cartoon ladybug. It's bigger than a real ladybug, but thank God Orbeetle exists. I'm a big Orbeetle supporter, by the way. Dishonorable mention time. There's only one. Granbull. I hate the skin fangs that it has. The rest is fine. It's a cartoon bulldog. I've seen better before, but at least it's pink and has those fangs to make it unique. But let's move on to the designs that have to be defended. Spinarak is boring, but its colors, frowny face, and the fact that it's slightly more appealing than a real spider saves it. Yanma is fine now that it has an evolution. It's cute and its colors are fun. Pineco isn't a pinecone. It's a bagworm, and that means it's meant to look like a pinecone. It would be unfair to knock off points for looking like one. Not the best design, but not the worst. And finally, the worst design in Generation 2. Sunflora. Guys, once again, I don't use this term lightly, but it's literally just a walking flower with a face. It's a concept we've seen like 387 times. Sure, it's an age-old idea, but does Sunflora at least do it the best? Perhaps it's like 17th place? I don't want you to misinterpret the criticism. These Pokemon aren't literally flowers. They have flowers on them, but they also incorporate other concepts like a masquerade or hula dancer. Sunflora does not. Gen 3, despite having a bit more Pokemon, managed to also only have 2 designs I think need a major rehaul. I'm super biased, by the way, so it's great that my viewers helped me narrow this down. Number 2. Volbeat. Illumise ain't the best as well, but most agree Volbeat is such an awkward design. It tries to combine the idea of a Firefly with the aesthetic of 50s youth, but in my opinion, unsuccessfully. Its origins barely surface, and it ends up looking like a human bug chimera. It's honestly not terrible compared to the entries from the previous generation, but it's not my fault Gen 3 stepped it up. It's not lazy, just ineffective. So, there's one dishonorable mention before moving on to the first entry, Castform. Say what you want about its gimmick, but at least its other forms are well designed. The problem is, Game Freak had to have known that the design would end up looking both too plain and evocative. But I generally think the fact that it looks like a water molecule and is based on Teruteru Bozus saves it. In fact, I didn't even want it on the list. I like Castform. It's my viewers who wanted it to have a mention. Some designs I would defend are Ninkata, who is worthless but makes total sense design-wise. Talo, who, in my opinion, has more personality and distinction from a real-life swallow to avoid being on the list, and Delcatty, whose neck pillow some find to be tacked on. Well, I think it makes sense considering its lore. But the worst design in Generation 3 is Luvdisc. I actually like Luvdisc since I think if a Pokemon is cute, it serves a purpose. But if I were to be more critical, it really is the most unnecessarily simple design in the game. They could have gave it fins and a soft pattern. It could have come in pairs, or at the very least, evolved into a Alomomola. Right now, its lack of progression doesn't justify its minimal design. Gen 4 has 2 entries as well, but a ton more dishonorable mentions. So, let's introduce number 2. Wormadam. I'm a Burmy fan through and through, but for some reason that doesn't extend to Wormadam. I guess without a visible mouth and charming curl, it's far less appealing. It has an awkward body and a boring face, kinda worse than the last. They aren't literal blobs, but their amorphous body is hard to make you feel any emotions. I like the pretty flowers, but that's really it. It's not an abomination, but as a person, I easily react in a positive way to most Pokemon, while Wormadam's design doesn't come close to getting me excited. Now here are some dishonorable mentions that I'm sure y'all would actually want on the list. I'm a Rhyperior fan. I don't find it as offensive as most do, but I can totally see where its design went wrong. It's clunky, over-designed, and unnatural looking. I can tell you why each aspect makes sense, but at the end of the day, most would say Rhydon is better. I dislike Carnivine, and I think it's unsettling, but that was kind of the point, so I'm not going to complain. The real design criticisms relate to its incongruous body parts. Probopass is another Pokemon I'm fine with. Its metal shavings mustache is genius, and its hat and eyes all allude to its inspiration. But my opinion doesn't matter when its design is one of the least popular. Lumineon is boring, but that doesn't mean it has a bad design. It's barely an honorable mention. And finally, Magmortar. I'm a huge Magmortar defender. People find it both goofy and creepy. Yeah, have you seen a Magmar? Magmortar isn't supposed to be handsome. My viewers brought up its egg-shaped body as if it was a flaw, and its short lips looking crazy as if its puffy and burnt bill was a mistake. I truly think Magmortar with its arm cannon doesn't even deserve to be in this video, unlike the abomination that is the number 1 entry. Ambipom. Unlike Pokemon like Magmortar, Ambipom wasn't designed to look creepy. But here we are. I'm not gonna even make eye contact with it. Its snub nose, wide eyes, $5 haircut, and fingerless hands don't do it any favors. They even downgraded its tail from Apoms. Those fingers do not look like fingers. While I think it's an unsuccessful design, I can see a couple of people vibing with it. It's not complete garbage. That's where Gen 5 comes in. That was a Garbodor reference, by the way. I don't think Gen 5 is garbage. It's actually my favorite generation. But it's a huge roster with a quantity over quality kind of attitude. Game Freak threw in some stinkers among some absolute bangers. So number 7 is Zoc. Throws an honorable mention. But by Generation 5, you'd assume Game Freak would know how to make a fighting type that doesn't look like a human wearing clothes. It's not worse than Hitmonchan, but it's less interesting. It was originally going to be more Oni-like, with a more prominent horn, but that would have clashed with the forces of nature, so they made a silly Muppet wearing a gi. It doesn't look like a wild animal. If they would have leaned in on the crisscross pattern and made it a crystallized fighter, it would have been saved. Number 6. Girder. Many would put the entire family on the list, but I generally don't think Conkeldurr is a bad design, and Timber is the most natural looking of the 3. I appreciate the clever combination of clown and construction worker by meeting in the middle and making them a circus strongman. A carny construction worker is very New York, but a Pokemon constantly carrying a girder is preposterous. Its legless thighs are odd, its veins are unholy, its nose hilarious, and its tumor-ridden head disgusting. It's an unappealing Pokemon. I'm okay with it, but I definitely get the hate. Number 5. Vanillish. Again, people have problem with the entire line, but that's kind of emotionally charged. People hate the concept of an ice cream Pokemon, despite the execution being pretty successful in Vanillite's design. It's a very cute and charming Pokemon, and a clever first stage in the family. Vanillix ending up with a double cone and wafer is a fine place to end up with, and it very much looks like a sentient icicles with snow on top. It's not literal ice cream, and I think its design does a good job conveying that. But notice how the smaller forehead and eyes on Vanillish makes it creepier than its evolved form. It's the least tempting of the three, the goofiest and most upsetting. But at the end of the day, I wouldn't get too mad at ice cream though. Number 4. Herdier. This is the Pokemon closest to being a literal animal. Even Pidgey doesn't really look like a specific bird, while generations later, Game Freak gave us a Pokemon that is literally a Yorkshire Terrier. There's nothing even close to fantastical about this design and concept too. No patterns, colors, or expression that makes it anything but a cartoon dog. Its only purpose is to be a transition between a cute puppy and a heroic-looking canine. But by definition of being a dog, I still like it. Number 3. Palpitoad. This is one of the most goofy looking Pokemon, and not even in a good way. I think Tympole is a cute tadpole, and Seismitoad can be menacing. But Game Freak's attempt to making a bridge between the two was botched. The loudspeaker aesthetic simply doesn't work on this blob. It looks like it's stuck mid-evolution, like it's sprouting feet and extra bumps to become Seismitoad. But you accidentally pressed B, and it didn't revert back to Tympole. It has no merit on its own. It looks like a mutated Pokemon. Number 2. Simisear. Simipour is actually my least favorite of the trio, so you know I'm not being biased this time. This thing is supposed to be a biker slash chef. Two pretty badass things were fused to make one of the most lame Pokemon. Simisear never looks right. It's not fun. It's not cute. It's not powerful looking. It's a vastly inferior Infernape. The proportions of the Simis are bad in general, and their elements unnaturally incorporated, but this is the worst offender, unfortunately. But there are some dishonorable mentions. I mentioned Throw before. Its proportions save it, though. Ducklet is pretty bland. It's neither an ugly duckling nor extremely cute. It's just there, slightly below average at best. Simipour is not a well-executed sea monkey, but even I can admit it's kind of fun. Tranquil is peak boring, way less clever than Pidove. In fact, it's the last honorable mention, while the following are actually Pokemon I'd defend. Pidove is actually a perfect representation of what Pidgey isn't. It has a personality that differentiates it from the real bird, and a subtle heart shape on its chest. It has a concept apart from being a bird, so it's definitely not on the list. Garbodor is literally a pile of trash, so people hate its concept and assume its design sucks too. But for a garbage monster, it's a pretty fine design. It's allowed to be ugly. Diagonal is also an abysmal concept, but for a sentient snowflake, at least they didn't attach goofy googly eyes and a mouth. It's a bit artistic. Gothitelle is not as well designed as Gothorita, but its abstract shapes can be seen as creative. The forces of nature are not terribly designed. They were very much meant to look like kami such as Raijin and Fujin. The problem was mostly the fact that they look similar to each other, but because of that, I can't pick one to be at fault. At least their Therian forms are pretty cool. People give the Swords of Justice a bit of flack for having humanoid faces and awkward feet. I'm gonna say that they're far from terribly designed, but out of these three musketeers, Terrakion is indeed the one with the most uncanny face. I agree it could have been less flat, despite being a favorite of mine. While we aren't touching forms in this video, I do want to address the hate for Kyurem's black and white forms. I can't stand hearing people say that they're not well designed because they look like asymmetrical abominations. That's literally the point. They're incomplete fusions. Unnatural. For the sake of the story, it has to look like this, and it doesn't even look bad. It's pretty monstrous. And finally, you can hate Emboar and even Samurott all you want, but neither are bad designs. Emboar's a pig. It's gonna be less than pretty. Samurott being a quadruped doesn't make it a bad design. You just don't like its progression from Duat, and that's fair, but on its own, it's a pretty rad drawing, and makes total sense both conceptually and artistically. Unlike the number 1 entry. Clang. The whole family's below average, but at least the other two begin and end this concept. Kling is incredibly lazy. They just put googly eyes on a gear, copy and pasted it, and called it a day. At the very least, the duality of Kling having 2 gears gives it a Gemini aspect. Kling is the most underwhelming final stage, but the added spikes add something cool to the mix. Klang, on the other hand, doesn't give us the pleasure of seeing 2 gears interact now that the face of the other one is gone, and doesn't add enough to make it a stimulating concept or design in any way. There are like 50 methods one could use to make a gear Pokemon. Magearna was on the top of the list and Klang was at the bottom. How can I grow attached to something that basic and inexpressive? One of the only Pokemon in existence I basically renounce. I don't even hate it, it's just simply the opposite of why I'm interested in Pokemon. Gen 6 with its tiny roster only has one design my viewers and I agreed is way below average in execution. Before revealing the pick, here are the dishonorable mentions. Quilladin, in my opinion, is just as goofy and awkward as most of the middle stage starters, but its beady eyes and pointy nose makes it look more eerie than most. I find it okay, and will die on that hill, that Quilladin's heft is not a design flaw. Slurpuff isn't bad, just unconventional, and Delphox has a ton of minor flaws that add up, but at the end of the day, it's simply below average for a starter Pokemon, and not really a below average design overall. I have two Pokemon that people would like to be dishonorable mentions, but I personally think their designs are good. Barbaracle is a barnacle. It's gonna look ugly. People have a problem with its hand faces, but that's literally the concept. For what they were going for, I think it ended up looking barbaric. Not every Pokemon should look aesthetically pleasing, and the idea of a keyring Pokemon may be problematic, but in execution, it's pretty cute and harmless. But the only Pokemon in Generation 6 that I think has a botched design is Aromatisse. Originally, I was going to give it a pass and assume that I was just biased, but no, everyone agreed. Game Freak unintentionally made Aromatisse one of the most crude Pokemon ever. A big reason is that its concept was genius. Combining Perfume, Plague Doctor, Masquerade, and Can-Can Dancer could have worked. While this old redesign of mine is very flawed, it's closer to what we imagined. It doesn't need to be a full-on Plague Doctor, but it has to look somewhat confident and refined. When a Pokemon doesn't pull off the personality it was given, it ends up looking uncomfortable, like Aromatisse. It's a mess. I can empathize with it though. Perhaps I should have been giving Aromatisse the benefit of the doubt, and the whole idea is that she's trying her best and is confident in herself, but simply isn't pulling it off considering she's so short and stout. Now I really want to use one. Now we kinda have a problem, guys. We have 0 entries for Generation 7. I like Generation 7 a lot, but I never considered its Pokedex my favorite. The problem, or technically the blessing upon Generation 7, is that by this time, Game Freak knew how to flesh out every design. Even the worst ones have a reason they look the way they do. The flaws are no longer unintentional. It doesn't mean Gen 7 has the best Pokedex, just one of the most refined. Every design has a purpose, so I took the dishonorable mentions and made them our 2 entries. So number 2 is Crabominable. It's definitely one of, if not the least popular Gen 7 Pokemon, and I agree that it's off-putting, but I personally think its design is overall good. It just makes people uncomfortable, and that's not really a bad thing. It wasn't made to sell plushes. It's a Yeti crab, which live deep underwater and aren't the prettiest things on Earth. So Game Freak cleverly gave us an abominable snowman crab that lives alone in high mountains. It's an ugly hermit. They even made its fists have foot patterns, so when it drags its knuckles on the ground, it leaves a Bigfoot footprint. It has gorilla pecs and hillbilly hat hair. It's intentionally disheveled, but if it has no fans, I guess it deserves to be on the list. Since the dishonorable mentions are actual entries, the following are simply Pokemon I need to defend. While I never wanted my cute Bounsweet to turn into a sexy fruit, Tarina, unlike Aromatisse, kinda pulls it off. Como-O gets fans flustered on account of its clanging scales. They think it has too many of them, but that's the whole idea of the design. I have no problem with furry-looking Pokemon, but Zeraora, to me, looks like a literal fursuit. It has the proportions of a man in a mascot costume, but it's not a bad design at all. Buchanan went from a design I was disappointed in to one I really appreciate. The anger suits it. It's a neat juxtaposition. Its beak lights up and fires. That's why it's a cannon. It's a fun concept with neat execution. Trumbeak was gonna be a dishonorable mention, but it's not worth my time. It's just slightly below average. It's the 3rd worst in the region though, in my opinion. But before moving on to number 1, Ultra Beasts are not badly designed. They are supposed to look alien and complicated. They were meant to look like incomprehensible Lovecraftian monsters. They have a place in the franchise and are here to stay. Ultra Beast lives matter. And finally, the worst design in Generation 7 is Ruxish. I don't think it's a terrible design, just the least appealing in Alola. It was designed to look ugly. It's based on a Humu Humu Nuku Nuku Wapua'a. Reef triggerfish look kinda ugly and have disturbing teeth. The psychedelic patterns on Bruxish make sense for a psychic type. It was designed to look lecherous yet unpleasant to look at. That's a trope in media. Hell, there are real-life people like this. The problem is, nobody wants this. Gen 8 time. It has more Pokemon than you think, with a lot of unique takes and valid experimentation. So number 3, Sneasler. This is an entire person, my dude. Out of any of the fur-ridden Pokemon, this one has the most human-like proportions. Obviously, it being bipedal isn't a problem, and the concept is great, but its limbs are the length of some humans in the Pokemon world. Minus its claws, of course. It's uncanny, especially with its extremely anthropomorphic expressions and poses. There's too much empty space below its chest, almost like they simply stretched out a Hisuian Sneasel. In Pokemon, an evolution is rarely the previous form, but taller. It makes the Pokemon look less like metamorphosis and more like aging. It's not the appeal of Pokemon evolution. These are minor problems, but it all adds up. I would be okay with a sexy Sneasel if it looked good. Number 2, Enamorous. Like the other members of the Kami trio, all of its attributes relate to its origin, so everything checks out conceptually, but when you add an even more unpopular member to an already unpopular group, you know something went absolutely wrong. It's supposed to be feminine, but that basically amounts to skinny and pink and a lot of stereotypical features. The lipstick looks tacky, the hair looks even more anthropomorphic than any of the styles the masculine trio has. I just never imagined a Pokemon with a receding hairline. I'm not one to talk, but it just seems like a human trait. It looks like a Zelda character, not a Pokemon. Kind of reminiscent of gay stereotypes I've seen in other anime, and I don't know if it's in good faith this time, but I'll give them the benefit of the doubt. I just think they should have gone all in and made it look extremely feminine. Like, I know a lot of people champion it as a quote-unquote twink Pokemon, but it's female. I mean, if the others are peak masculinity, shouldn't this one be very feminine instead of kind of androgynous? Or the opposite, what if it was female, but extremely masculine, like the others? That would have been interesting. I just don't know their intention. But if it was meant to be a representation of androgyny, wouldn't it be more beneficial for a niche group if their sole representation was designed in a way that was popular instead of hated? At the end of the day, it's not about whether or not I'm correct about my criticism, but the fact that we're also confused about its intention is what makes it an unsuccessful design. I'm fine if they simply wanted to make a Pokemon sleigh like Roserade. I just don't think they pulled it off. Same problem as Aromatisse. But before moving on, here are some dishonorable mentions I'm sure you expected to be on the list. Inteleon. It's a relatively bad design for a starter Pokemon, but it's not terrible as a Pokemon design. It's too skinny, its hands are too humanoid, and its stance is incredibly anthropomorphic. While a lot of its spy traits clutter its already thin design, I think we've all gained a little more appreciation over the last few years for its personality and origins. Greedent is also pretty cartoony, but it's all in the eyes. I think the dude was made to be goofy, so I can't say it's unsuccessful. Toxel is an ugly baby that does not fit stylistically into the Pokemon world. It looks like a gremlin Neopet, but I assume Game Freak designed it to fulfill such a trope. Like Impidimp, it's a changeling imp. It's supposed to look like something out of a fairy tale. Sure, it could have been a bit less cartoony, but it works. Milcery is the most minimal design in all of Pokemon. I should really be criticizing it, but it's extremely cute and made out of pure cream. It works really well in motion within the game, and that's kind of what a lot of designs in Galar were meant to do. Ice-Q is absurd, but the idea was absolutely genius. You can redesign it how you want, but Game Freak intentionally gave it an ice cube over its head. The gag only works if it's perfectly cuboid. Stunjourner was wasted potential, and its proportions are off, but for a walking Stonehenge, it's just mid. It's not offensive. It's another Pokemon that works best when you see it in its environment, like a roaming ancient titan. That's the problem. It's really hard to judge Gen 8 designs unless you look at them in full context. That's why I'm defending the following. They aren't even close to bad. Colossal should have been a train, but our expectations got the best of us. It looks relatively generic, but it's not terrible. In fact, its G-Max form is exactly what I wanted, so it makes its regular form a bit more understandable. Lipbug is a little egghead nerd. This ladybug larva has a disproportionate head for a reason. Boltund has the little proportions of a greyhound. It's supposed to be skinny, but it tricks people into thinking it's just a dog, when in reality the patterns and colors make it fit into the Pokemon world. I don't like the colors, but they're unique. Paparaja is one of my favorite Pokemon in Generation 8. It's a cube, but get over it. It's a copper statue. The shape and colors make total sense. Of course, making sense doesn't mean it's a good design, but it's not like this elephant is a hated Pokemon. Because the actual worst Pokemon design in Generation 8 is Eternatus. This is an odd case. The only Pokemon here because we don't know enough about it to justify its unusual design. Why does it look the way it does? It's a dragon skeleton. It's probably the only Pokemon I can confidently say doesn't look like a Pokemon. I get that the shock factor of discovering such a mind-blowing creature during the climax of Sword and Shield may have been the purpose of giving it such an otherworldly presence, but I'd say Ultra Necrozma and the Ultra Beasts nailed that already in Generation 7 while still actually looking like Pokemon. If Gen 8 was still ongoing, I'd say we shouldn't criticize it yet, but it's been enough time to rightfully demand an explanation. It's a sick piece of art, but is it a good Pokemon design? You tell me. Finally, Gen 9. Recency bias makes some of my opinions on these extreme, but I'm sure if you asked me a year or two from now, my critique would be less heated. Number 4. Ramblin'. There are so many ways to make a ghost tumbleweed without it literally being a sentient tumbleweed. These are my crack at the same concept a couple years ago. Ramblin' is somewhat cute, but it's literally just a tumbleweed with 2 leaves as eyes. It's the bare minimum. It's cute and somewhat appealing, but incredibly uncreative. At least when it evolves, the configuration of the branches look like a creepy face. That's technically art. This isn't. Number 3. Squawkabilly. They were close. It has a pompadour and jacket-like feathers, but it's executed in such an uncreative way. It's plain. You can still make a minimally designed rockabilly parrot without it being complicated. Look at Ginger Ninja's redesign. June changed nothing. It's the same Pokemon, but now it looks like how a professional should design a character without it looking like a generic cartoon character. Number 2. Bellybolt. Its concept is neat, and I wouldn't blame you for thinking it's cute, but it doesn't look like a living creature. It looks like a mascot that was made to sell toys. Every single trait that could have made it look like a living creature was stripped. It has nubs where frog hands or legs would be, its face is painted on, and even its eye-like horns are just googly eyes. In a previous generation, this interesting trait would be cleverly incorporated to make it look like a headphones or actual tympanum, or at least frog eyes, instead of just generic cartoon googly eyes. There are tons of great redesigns that at the very least give it back the form of a frog. Keep in mind the avocado aspect is just an afterthought and completely unnecessary to keep when redesigning this thing. Here are some of the others that could have been on the list. Strudel. Its sharp tooth. Yes, that's not a tongue. Well, they clip through the ground in 3D space and make it look even more creepy. One of the least cute of the supposedly cute Pokemon. Flamigo's design is aight. It's supposed to be this minimal. It's kind of funny too. But forgive me for not thinking a cartoon flamingo isn't the most creative of designs. Tandemaus is a great concept and it's entertaining. I just don't think it needed to look this simple. It's just 2 cartoon mice. A more noticeable pattern or tuft of fur would make it less generic. And Goldengo is a good Pokemon with a fine design. It just looks too much like a mascot to naturally feel like part of the Pokemon world. I like it though. Iron Jugulis isn't a bad design, since it literally looks like a Hydreigon, which is a good design. But the problem is, it changes the least out of any Paradox form, and I don't think that's okay. And Monkey Dory, while fine by me, seems to make too many people uncomfortable to not mention. We don't know enough about it to say whether or not its design is intentionally uncanny or not, so it's not on the list. But number 1 is pretty straightforward. Pawmot. We know how appalling it is that we received a line of Pokemon that changes nothing twice. It goes through 2 evolutions, and all that happens is that it gets taller. No added pattern or color or even a different face. Evolutionarily, it's worse than Poliwrath or Kling. People who are following my criteria may say, I said that a bad evolution doesn't equal a bad design. And you're right. But guess what? That's the reason Pomo isn't here. Yes, technically Pomo changed the least. It's a Pommy that stands up, but Pommy's design is fine. And having it stand up kinda looks good too. In fact, it looks feistier, so I'd say Pomo has a good design. But when it evolves, its head gets bigger, but the face stays the same, giving it an uncanny baby face on a longer and more empty body, with large baggy arms that look unproportionate. I always thought Pommy had a small face, but then its fully evolved form keeps the face small while expanding the cranium? There's no reason for that. It doesn't look correct. It's the Pokemon with my least favorite proportions, especially in 3D. But I hope you enjoyed this video at least. Leave a like if you did, and subscribe for more videos like this. Check the description for my Patreon, or click the join button to get cool rewards like seeing videos days early, and a huge discount on the t-shirts I made for you guys. Follow me on Twitter where I post sneak peeks of my art too. Bye!